Who else is coming?
I
Who
think
else?
that's I think that's all of us. Well, good evening, everyone. We're doing, I guess this is going to be part one of a two-parter, Schopenhauer versus Seneca. Yay. We need like a showdown kind of montage. This is
Did you get that idea of epic rap battles of history, the verses thing with the philosophers or something?
um I don't think I got it from there, but I have seen some of those. They're very funny. It's a good
You
idea.
could do a rap battle.
Yeah, if I was more talented, maybe Vincent could come up with a rap. But the reading on Schopenhauer, or from Schopenhauer, was on the sufferings of the world. It wasn't particularly long. Did
I thought it
anyone?
was. Oh, okay. No, it's okay.
Yeah, what would you like to say about it before we go through it bit by bit? Now you can say your piece, Vincent. What did you think about
Oh
it?
no, I was just I was getting my wires crossed here. So because there was chapters, right? I thought it was essays and pessimism, but that's the whole group, isn't it? And the one specifically was the one you just said.
Yeah, I selected on the sufferings of the world
Right.
because it's not too long.
Hmm.
Okay. So, but it did it. I thought it was quite an interesting read. I thought it was there's certain things that really jumped out at me that I thought were kind of um, made a lot of sense in the context of our reading the Hellenistic schools. To me, it seemed to tie in very well with some of the comments that we've seen from Epicurus and Lucretius. Um, in a way, it makes a good kind of counter argument against the Epicurean kind of account, I think, but it doesn't come anywhere near touching the surface of the Stoic argument, I would say. So, what do you guys think?
Well, I was really struck by the fact that I agree with you, Courtney, that I think Schopenhauer uses some quite striking uh, arguments for his position. But it's also clear that there's some kind of personality things going on as well, I would say. And in a sense, he's finding justifications or arguments for the way for a kind of an emotional response, like perhaps that's kind of how it struck me.
Jody, what do you think?
I thought it was a really good, argument from his point of view on the nature of evil and the nature of man's struggle, existential struggle. And I thought it was, quite a valid debate from his side. I thought he raised some really intriguing and important practical points. um, um, yeah, well, we'll get into the text. Yeah, we can talk about that as we get into the text.
I think Vincent's got some views on Schopenhauer you might share. What do you think?
Um, so I had this discussion with Courtney separately just about how a philosopher's own circumstances and history inform their philosophy so much. So yeah, like to take to take that concept that life is either boredom or suffering, I think that has a lot of truth in a way. And I'm certainly keen to unpack that. But I also think in terms of boredom, that could well describe his own situation in a sense, because he was fortunate in that he inherited enough money that he didn't need to he could go down whatever rabbit hole or talk about whatever he wanted to do. He was frugal with his money. He was smart, so he wasn't doing it to pay the rent or feed himself. He could do Also didn't have a family. I don't think many relationships, and sort of so anyway, coming around to it, the boredom thing, it's easy to see how that could happen for him. Suffering, I wonder exactly how much of his own suffering was physical, especially in the later years, of course, but also versus emotional, psychological. So he didn't get the recognition he craved and arguably deserved until right at the end. So, you know, I can understand how he could see the world in terms of suffering and boredom, and those two, and one versus the other. I think that's a general truism, but I also think that for him it was particularly acute because it wasn't offset by the joy of being a parent, for example, or being in an intimate relationship.
Hang on a second. Ray, you've got your background noise on.
Pressure mounting for her to step aside. Somewhat that any successor.
I'm looking for
Ray, I'm competing with the news on your TV.
The completion of the first escalator in the
Hang on, I'm looking for that.
project,
I
acting
should be
Premier
able to
Stephen
control it.
Miles denies he's after the top
Oh,
job.
here we go. Yeah, I worked it out.
Is that Alex and not Ray? Because we can't see him, and it's
Mate.
just like running interference on the meeting.
Sorry. I had to figure out how to mute Ray. You'll go.
Yeah. Well, yeah, maybe you guys got my point. So that's just, so like I was saying to Courtney too, I've got this book on Schopenhauer, and the first part is on his biography and the second part is on his philosophy. And I always get hooked into the first part because I really believe that psychology and philosophy go together so well. They're so important. So really, when you're looking at anyone's philosophy, you have to examine the psychology of the writer. So what's going on in their own life, in their own head, are they happy or what? I mean, you're not going to have a miserable person writing happy philosophy, although that's not always the rule, but you can see what I'm saying there. So
very good. Anyone else read it? Travis, you probably read it then.
No, I opened up the document and thought, oh, I'll come to it later, and never did. Just coming back from being ill and everything, I never got around to it.
That's all right. Shannon, anything to say about it?
Yeah, sorry, I came in late. Are we talking about both texts or just the one?
Just on the sufferings of the world.
Yeah, well, this applies to both, but I really like how it was written. I didn't agree with it, but I also thought it was interesting, like how I think there's some parts in the text that sort of seem to agree, or at least, they have some crossover with the Stoic view. So that was interesting. Yeah. I guess, yeah, that was definitely my general thoughts. I don't know if I agree fully on that psychology is that important around the philosophy. Like, I think that's sort of, like, it's not to say it's without merit, but I wouldn't say it's the be all end all. But yeah, that's probably my general thoughts.
Sorry, guys. For some reason, we're seeing Ray Bergman's whiteboard.
Can you guys see? It looks like a phallic symbol being drawn. No?
Anyway, for some reason, Ray Bergman's trying to take over the computer. So I'm sorry. I'm getting good at like suddenly learning how to stop people from interfering with things. Yeah. So working.
Yeah, bro. Facebook and now this, man.
Yeah. All right. So we'll jump straight in. So straight out of the gate, right? He says, unless suffering is the direct and immediate object of life, our existence must entirely fail of its aim. That's pretty tongue-in-cheek, isn't it? Or rude, or whatever you put it. And we take it that each separate misfortune as it comes seems no doubt to be something exceptional. True. But misfortune in general is the rule. Yep. So he's saying basically we've got lots of misfortune to look forward to. And he goes on to say, I know of no greater absurdity than that propounded by most systems of philosophy in declaring evil to be negative in character. So that all so far makes sense. He's sort of saying that the good is negative, in fact. Happiness and satisfaction always implies some desire fulfilled, some state of pain brought to an end. So I think already you're starting to look at it. Well, it appears to look much more like the Epicurean, like a critique to the Epicurean argument, right? What do you think, Judith? You're looking at maybe no?
Well, the person I most associate with this view that he's attacking, that in declaring evil to be negative in its character, well, Augustine was the person who I think did the most work on that in establishing what later became standard Christian doctrine, that evil is an absence of good. And we saw it in Boethius, I seem to remember. Do you remember that, Courtney?
Oh, no, but he's saying evil is positive. And
yeah, I know, but I'm just saying what he's attacking, where it came from, I suppose. But he's associating with Leibniz, but in fact it was current, like, you know, from pretty much from Augustine onwards. So I don't know quite why he's picking on Leibniz. But yes, I think he's kind of inverting that by saying that it is the good which is negative, because that's, yeah, a kind of an Epicurean position that the definition of good is the absence of pain or absence of suffering.
Yes.
So yeah, he's kind of reverting to a quasi-Epicurean position.
Yeah, good. As we go along, I kept thinking like that this could apply very well to the Epicurean as a kind of counter attack of pleasure, because the Epicurean account, right, is that it's not so much pleasure as the good. I guess that's one way of putting it, but it's the absence of pain, right? Which makes it a negative thing. And all right. So the pleasure in this world, it has been said, outweighs the pain. This is a really interesting reductio, I reckon. You know, he says, at any rate, there's an even balance between the two. If the reader wishes to see shortly whether this statement is true, let him compare the respective feelings of two animals, one of which is engaged in eating the other. I mean, to me, that's like a reductio absurdum, you know, just for the sake of sophistry, really. Because later he attacks, well, just previously he attacks Leibniz for sophistry, right?
Yeah, no, he's definitely engaging in sophistry, because whatever's going on with the two animals, and I guess, yeah, I mean, animal A, the one who's eating, the one who's doing the eating is just satisfying his or her natural impulse to maintain life by eating. So that's not really the same, I would have thought, as what he's talking about. I mean, and obviously the animal being eaten is suffering, but is that equivalent to human suffering of the kind he's really gesturing to? It seems a bit of a stretch.
Yeah, and if we're talking, it's kind of strange. He's talking about the balance of pleasure and pain, and then he's talking about, well, that's absurd, because if one's eating the other, there's definitely no balance there.
Yeah, and it's like just on that previous section where he's talking about that pleasure is the negative and pain is the positive. Like it just doesn't reflect my experience. Like they feel like, in terms of pain, like they can exist simultaneously. No, I guess it depends exactly what we mean by pain, but if we're just talking the like negative stimuli, there can be sort of that negative stimuli, which is in some ways also enjoyable. Like, and I was reflecting on this because I'm on holiday and I was in a spa while reading it, which was quite nice. But it was really hot water, so like there is like some level of pain that I get from that, but it's kind of enjoyable. And also while I was there, I was drinking whiskey, which like it burns while it goes down, but it's kind of an enjoyable pain. Like, but there is like pain is part of it. So I don't know if I completely agree with this idea of them being opposites completely.
Which is an argument, right, Judith, that comes up in the Gorgias between Socrates and Callicles. They have this back and forward about, well, good and pain? How do you pass them apart? Can't remember exactly how it played out, but it's pretty much what you're talking about, Shannon. So moving along, he's saying that the best consolation in misfortune or affliction of any kind will be the thought of other people who are in a worse situation than yourself. And he says, well, that's a pretty terrible fate for mankind as a whole, if that's the best consolation you can come up with on the fly, sort of thing. We are like lambs in a field, he says, disporting themselves under the eye of a butcher. He's got these great metaphors. So it really pairs well with Seneca's text, because Seneca also has really great metaphors. He says that on our good days, we are all unconscious of the evil that's probably going to befall us at some point in the near future. Fate may have presently in store for us sickness, poverty, mutilation, loss of sight or reason.
Now, I'm just going to interject here, because this is exactly where Stoicism has a role to play, because it does premeditate on the bad things that are likely to happen. So he's kind of skating over it by saying, you know, we're unaware of these things. Well, we don't have to be unaware of these things. And to some extent, at least, forewarned is forearmed.
Yeah, definitely. He says, if at any time, well, if at any moment time stays his hand, it is only when we are delivered over to the misery of boredom. So that's what Vincent was talking about. So if we're not being victimized by misery, we're bored. But misfortune has its uses. Well, and this is what seems to, you know, starting out making some really useful claims here, especially this bit. Misfortune has its uses. This is something that Seneca is going to expand on, but in a very different way. For as our bodily frame would burst asunder if the pressure of the atmosphere, if the pressure of the atmosphere was removed. So if the lives of men were relieved of all need, hardship, and adversity, if everything they took in hand were successful, they would be so swollen with arrogance that though they might not burst, they would present the spectacle of unbridled folly. Nay, they would go mad. Well, I just thought that's a load of shit for a start. You know, like, I just don't buy that. And it reminded me of that scene in The Matrix, right, where Agent Smith is massaging Morpheus's head, and he's like, you guys are a bunch of viruses. We tried to make it perfect for you. We made this perfect world where you're always happy, and you guys rejected it because you're just gross and you just can't handle perfection and goodness. And it just sounds like that. It's just like, well, I don't think I'd go mad and have a bad time if everything I applied my hand to worked out well. I'd be quite content. I expect Shannon's got a view on this.
Yeah, like I actually find it agreeable. That's interesting that you don't think that's the case. Like I think like a little bit of pushback is good. Like going back to the like the whiskey and the spa example, like it is enjoyable just having that, you know, that like that controlled bit of suffering or adversity. Obviously there's like questions of degrees and stuff like that, like, you know, but yeah, I think at least like a little bit of adversity is a good thing.
Yeah, but he'd say you're going to go mad. Unbridled folly if everything went well.
So
Yeah,
there's,
sorry, you go, Vincent.
look, I think there's plenty of historical examples of people in this position. It's happened for centuries and centuries. There's been people in absolute power, and what do they do with it? So if you say, look at Rome, for instance, these emperors, well, what did they do? I mean, they had everything provided for. Yes, there was things to concern themselves, like if they got offside with the ruling elite or light, I get those mixed up, elite, or the populace, then they might, you know, die. But there was that one emperor, what was his name? He got off on torturing people, throwing like the crowds into the Colosseum and stuff.
Vincent
So that's a form. Hey,
his name is Vincent Lyon.
Yeah, he's referenced in a Tool song. Anyway, so what happened with these people in great power? I mean, so the last, what was it? The last king of France, what did he occupy himself with? It was lavish parties. The people were starving, hunting pheasants, all this stuff. So people that do have excesses of power, they do kind of go mad. Either they try and conquer more, like Napoleon or someone, or they just get off in torturing people and creating misery, or they just sort of lose themselves in frivolous pursuits, or just constantly intoxicated and stuff. Do you know what I mean? Like I'm saying,
Yeah, no,
this has happened in the past.
I totally agree with that. Like, I think like an even less exotic example, and it feels relevant to myself because something's happened to me, which is like I've been a stay-at-home dad, and luckily I've been able to study while I've been doing that. I would have gone insane without studying because it's not like keeping a child alive. I think it's challenging because of the monotony of it, like just how boring it is. And it's like, not that I'd ever like strongly judged people, but that stereotype of the stay-at-home wife who like drinks, it's like, oh yeah, no, I understand that now. Like, if I wasn't studying, I'd probably be drinking. Like, it's just, you don't have that stimulation. Now, I guess like on the other hand though, like to Courtney's point that it would cause, what was it, madness and folly or something. I can't remember the exact quote, but yeah, it's hard like just going like, well, this is like how I think I would respond to it, and then applying that to all people seems a bit, maybe that's a bit of a strong, that's like making a stronger claim.
But
And
I was just going to say, your situation has some hardship. You're facing boredom and humdrum and child vomit and things like that. The argument really is saying, imagine if everything went perfectly all the time and it was blissful. And like he says here, he says, if the world were a paradise of luxury and ease, a land flowing with milk and honey, where every jack obtained his Jill at once and without any difficulty, men would either die of boredom or hang themselves. I just think that's rubbish. And you know what it says to me? It just says exactly what the skeptics were saying before, that there's this isosthenia. You could, for every argument, you can create an equal opposite argument with equal force against it. And all he's doing is what the skeptics were doing, but in reverse. Rather than coming up with a plausible positive argument, he's coming up with a plausible negative argument. That's how I see it.
yeah, I think like you have a point. I think like I think when I read it, I sort of just skimp over those as poetic language, but yeah, maybe he does sort of mean it more literally, and I'm just sort of willing to push it to the side and be like, oh yeah, no, he's not literally, but yeah, maybe he is literally saying that.
I do
Well,
think
oh,
sorry, you go.
okay. I think he does mean it literally, but also I think it's a kind of an argument from well, it's an argument from idleness in a sense. He's taking as the default position. I think he's taking perhaps his own perspective, as you say, Shannon, as kind of normative. So just because he would die of boredom if everything went well for him, why would he generalize that to the rest of humanity? It seems a stretch, because people can and do and have chosen to occupy themselves constructively even when they didn't have to. And the counter argument around Vincent, your point around absolute power, and yeah, I mean, I'm a broken record when it comes to Marcus Aurelius, but he is the counter argument. And also his predecessor Antoninus Pius, they were in absolute power, but they were good men and they ruled well and they did not go mad. Now they were not counterexamples in the sense that everything went well for them. Obviously it didn't. They were fighting wars, there were plagues, there were floods and everything else. And that's why, in a sense, that's also why I think Schopenhauer's saying, well, if he's creating what's really a straw man, by saying, well, if everything went well for everybody, they'd all go mad. Well, that's not a world we can recognize. That's, so we can't make judgments about how things would work out with that, because that's not our world. Our world is not one in which everything goes well for people all the time. So he's not even theorizing about people, it seems to me. It's all a big thought experiment in a way.
Yeah, it's totally hypothetical, and that's why I think it's sort of the inverse of the skeptical argument, because he could, even the Stoics wouldn't kind of start out with this kind of everything's positive, everything's golden, everything's great. He's sort of just making everything look really, really bad when it's not like that in reality. He says, for example, that just think of old men that get together, and don't they just get together and hate how life has turned out? It's like, no, very few old men I know sit around and talk about how much they fucking hate their lives. They've usually got good things to say about whatever's happened to them. It's like, fuck's sake, mate, you've got some weird friends, you know. But anyway,
I want to make a point if I can. Yeah. So the way I see it is that the dichotomy between boredom and pleasure is sorry, what was it? Boredom and suffering. Sorry. Yeah. That's something I see play out day to day over the centuries and in this modern life. So in my view, people that have healthy character and habits, they voluntarily introduce suffering to themselves to offset the boredom. So I'll give you a concrete example. A lot of healthy people elect to go to the gym. Now, what for? I mean, you've got cars, you've got elevators, the rest of it. Yeah, of course, it makes you more physically attractive, but I also feel as though people that are healthy, they're sort of wise to this conundrum. They choose to introduce that suffering, going to a gym, which is kind of unpleasant. The reason you feel some pain is because there's micro fissures that form throughout your muscles. Your muscles are actually splitting apart. That's why it hurts, and your muscles do throb for a time after. So why do it? Again, it's not just vanity. It's actually because people that are healthy choose to run marathons. They choose to withhold delicious food, work out. They choose to read books and put themselves through mental torment, suffering in a sense, because concentration is like that. Now, those that don't, what's the alternative? They sit and twiddle their thumbs. Not likely, because what comes with boredom is things to try and get away from the situation, like alcohol, drugs, gluttony, food, television, etc. So if you compare people that have a healthy lifestyle and voluntarily choose some kinds of suffering, like going to the gym and having a study routine, the alternative is often people that will overindulge in these things to offset the boredom. I think that's a real situation. I can personally testify to that. I don't usually voluntarily choose the suffering path, like go for a run or something. I'd rather have another drink. You know, you know what I'm saying, right? So I think there's some certain wisdom in that, personally.
yeah, I guess my counter to that as we go along will be that this argument doesn't stand up to the Stoic argument, because the Stoic argument would deal with boredom in its own way. But we'll get to that. We are like children in a theater before the curtain is raised, sitting there in high spirits and eagerly waiting for the play to begin. But the children in this story might seem like innocent prisoners condemned not to death, but to life. That's pretty dark. They're not condemned to death, they're condemned to life. And as yet, all unconscious of what their sentence means. Nevertheless, every man desires to reach old age. In other words, a state of life of which it may be said, it is bad today and it will be worse tomorrow, and so on, till the worst of all. What a crock of shit.
I just want to, just on similar lines, he has that, the part, I'm not sure exactly where you're already from, but the part where he's like, he who lives to see 2 or 3 generations, that basically, you know, they've seen this show like twice or thrice in succession. And really, you know, you only really need to see it once. No, any longer than that, and it ceases to be a novelty. Like, it's so funny. Like, it's so enjoyable to read, but yeah, it's definitely very objectionable.
It's just not true, you know, to say that every moment that you live is just like Nietzsche thought, an eternal recurrence of the same, because it's not. Like, the fact is, it's an illusion to think that every meal you have is just like the last one, but it's not. It's always a new meal, and it's up to you whether it's a new meal or just like the last one. You know, that's kind of the observation the Stoics make, right? That you live in a stream of time. You can't actually freeze time and get stuck in it. That's an illusion.
May I just say that I recognize his psychological state, though, because at different times in my life I've come through periods of depression, and I really, really recognize exactly what he's saying here. All these things he's saying, I've been there. I've lived all of that stuff. I've been thoroughly bored and just thought, I'm over this. I have nothing else that's going to be of interest. I've been everywhere, done everything I ever want to do. Look, I won't go on, but I'm just saying I do respond quite, in recognition to this. Not that I'm depressed now and I've stepped away from that state of mind, but I'm just saying I do recognize it. And I think when Vincent said before, you've got maybe you do have to consider the state of mind of the writer, because the psychology of the man obviously has come to play in these attitudes. And the attitudes he's holding now, and maybe he did hold them all his life. Every picture you ever see of him, he's looks incredibly unhappy. And and Vincent's read his biography. Yeah, he was never a really happy chap. But he was widely read. He was widely read in his, when he became popular. When would he have really reached his popularity peak? Would it have been in the early 1900s, when all the Eastern philosophies were starting to really get absorbed into the European circles of people that were, facilitating a lot more Eastern ideas? But he must have had some peak of recognition where he was popular. He was a popular writer. I was watching a Charlie Chaplin movie the other night, and Charlie Chaplin, one of the actress he's talking to, she's reading a novel, and he says to her, "What are you reading?" She says, "Schopenhauer." And he says to her, "Oh, have you read the essay on suicide?" Anyway, it's all part of the plot of the movie, but it was just interesting to see that talked and discussed in a Charlie Chaplin film. So he had some credibility in his day, at a time. But yeah, I agree. Look, because same thing, it's suffering. The Buddhists acknowledge suffering, and so does Seneca, because all through on Providence, he's acknowledging suffering and how we deal with it and why it's there, and it's a challenge and blah, 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 So it is part of life, and it is the way we deal with it. Anyway, I've got to shut up now.
That's all right. I was just going to say, Jodie, do you think, historical diagnosis is notoriously treacherous and fraught with uncertainty, but would you say that we're reading something written by someone who's clinically depressed?
I reckon yes, because I know when I've been clinically depressed, I have thought exactly this way. Yeah. Anyway, yeah.
No, and I must admit, I don't want to disparage that idea, that people who are depressed have very negative views about the world and we should feel sympathy for them. That's true, 100%. I guess the point is, in comparing this with the Stoics, we can't say, like later on, he'll say, my philosophy is actually the right way to read the New Testament. It's the true Christianity. But you're more likely right, Jodie. It's probably not. It's actually the ravings of someone who has a particular view of the world, and that view of the world looks like depression, as we'd call it today. And something like what Seneca talks about would look more like optimism, like a healthy attitude towards the world. However, what's the problem with Schopenhauer is he's actually saying that the optimists are just wrong, they're just wrong. So sorry, he's making metaphysical claims about the world. He's not talking about his own depressed state as well. Yeah.
I think like that's a two-way street though, if you start diagnosing, because then it can be simply like it's like we sort of go like just on the viewpoint. If you have an optimistic viewpoint, therefore it's true. If it's not the optimistic viewpoint, therefore it's wrong and they're depressed. Like it limits, like it should more be looking at the quality of the arguments.
Shannon,
they're
that's why I
presenting.
felt, yeah, that's why I felt he was really rational. That's why before you came in at the beginning, you know, we were just saying our first thoughts, and I said I thought he put forward a really rational set of valid arguments, really, because he wasn't being emotive. He was being rational. He was being very in a state of reasoning about the whole thing. You know, it was a very, very good debate. So I agree with you. Yeah.
On that note, just going back to the text, there was one which like felt very personally relevant to myself, where it has, if children were brought into this world by an act of reason, pure reason alone, would the human race continue to exist? Would not a man rather have so much sympathy with the coming generation as to spare it the burden of existence? And like, so this is something that I actually did wrestle with, like fully considered before having children.
It made me think of you, this part.
Yeah. It's like, absolutely. No, I absolutely did think about it. And I came out on the idea of like, yes, like it is worth, you know, procreating, and like, it seems okay, but yeah, it's a challenging thing. Like, but then it's like also too, just that could just be my personality of like overthinking things, and also getting enjoyment from this sort of stuff. So, you know, I'm not really sure whether it puts me in a better position or not to make the judgment, or if it was just a intellectual masturbation or procreation.
But the question here too, what you're talking about is, you know, if there's no pleasure involved or whatever, it was just something you decided because it made sense, it purely from reason's point of view. You know, for me, and this is the thing, remember, Schopenhauer is trying to make some sort of metaphysical claims here about the nature of the world. I would say, well, the world appears to me to be the kind of place that another human being would enjoy, because it's wonderful to see the sun come up every morning. It's wonderful to meet other people. It's wonderful to try new experiences. I would say that that's the nature of things in the world. If I have the right orientation to them, I would probably try and downplay how much that is my personality or my optimism or my not depressed state, for example. But he's doing exactly the same thing, but in reverse. He's just going, no, of course no one would want to be in the world because it's a heap of shit and you're going to die and you're going to suffer and you're going to get intestinal worms and your ass is going to fall out of your trousers. But yeah, how much is it a claim that this is the way the world actually is, or how much are we really saying this is the way I feel about being in the world? And are they inseparable? You know, that's kind of what you were saying, Vincent.
Yeah, I think it's hard to know. Like, there's like the sort of the arrogance of yourself where you're always like, I mean, in the general, you're like, we always view like what we believe as correct. So it's always going to be like, well, I'm an optimistic person, therefore life is good, and I enjoy the sunrise, and like it is really nice and pretty and enjoyable to live every day. So therefore, this is a matter of fact about the world. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, you know, go on.
You call it, Courtney. Who was first? Whose voice was
you, Vincent?
Okay, so I was just going to say, like, for future reference, for all of us, when we write our philosophical tomes, if that's the word, tome, big books, tome. Oh, yeah. It would be great to have a chapter in there where you savagely critique yourself and all of your arguments, because that would, or at least your own psychology. And I guess, no, I'll be more precise in my thought here. Just what I mean is that try to unearth any sort of biases that you might have in your worldview. So if Schopenhauer was able to do that, like, say, because from what I've read of him, he takes pretty big digs at people in general, humanity at large and then specific philosophers, but I don't know if he turns it on himself. If he did, it would add credibility, or at least it would make it easier to see. I think it would be useful for himself, because moving forward, then he would understand, yeah, okay, I'm a lonely dude that lives by myself and I haven't had a hug in decades, and it's informing the things I write. You know what I'm saying? So, but then that's left to us. That's why, for me, I find the biography stuff, well, it's always interesting, but when you come across someone who's overly positive or overly negative to the point that it's very much different than your own sort of outlook, then it's pretty, you can see why you're motivated to find out where they're coming from, what's their situation. That's what I find. So, it would be great if they were able to do that for themselves. So again, that's why I feel like there's a real kind of synergy between psychology and philosophy, in that as a philosopher, you need to really be mindful of, your own situation and own that, and then make that, see what I'm saying?
It comes down also, don't you think, to, without getting too into the psychology of it all, but it does come even back to childhood and how you were raised and how you were conceived. I mean, even in our little group here, I mean, how many of us are actually conceived in a happy, loving home? Like I was the result of a shotgun wedding between a 17-year-old and a 21-year-old, and I often think, well, what that I could have done, sometimes I've thought in my life, gee, I wish they hadn't never ever met, because it was just a mess for them. They were divorced within 18 months, like it's just life, some of us are born into happy lives and some of us aren't. So, it's a question of where, how was he born to happy parents? Schopenhauer, Vincent, Your thingy.
I think I read that there was a question whether his dad topped himself or not. Yeah, I wasn't quite clear. So,
But it's not, like, if you're looking at the odds of it, though, wouldn't most people have? Would be pretty like 50-50 on people having an unhappy home. Do you reckon? Like the odds are pretty high, so it's hard to draw conclusions from his life to his personal views.
Yeah, I mean, I think Judith and I would agree here that, yeah, it's interesting to speculate on people and try and work out their mental status, and but there's too many variables, and this is always the problem. I think we read about it in Pierre Hadot's book, if you remember that. He was saying that people try to read Marcus Aurelius as a depressed person and things like that, but he was saying no, he's writing within a tradition, and that was the style. So there's going to always be these debates, and I mean, at the end of the day, Schopenhauer is putting forward an argument that he tries to ground in a metaphysics, right? And he uses Eastern mysticism and stuff like that to support his claims. So he's not really just saying my mother beat me as a child and therefore the world's a bleak place. He's coming up with arguments, you know what I mean? He's doing his best to defend his position. So, but we can't know, right? So, but moving ahead, for example, he says, and it builds on what we're talking about. He says, ask your university professors, and they're bound to preach optimism, and it's an easy and agreeable task to upset their theories. And I just wrote a note here saying, well, you haven't convinced me yet. So I don't know. I mean, there's nothing he says in here that actually convinces me. So he says some really absurd stuff. I'd have to read more of him to be convinced. What did you guys think of that?
Listening to the start, certainly interesting around the weighting or the direction of the focus. Because I mean, it's not like what Schopenhauer has written is wrong, because we will certainly experience sickness, poverty, loss of sight, reason, hardship, and all of those things. I suppose it's just missing that orientation or frame of reference like the Stoics might have around, well, what an opportunity then to test our character and become resilient or be virtuous. You know, he just skips all of that at the moment.
Yeah, but the problem even with that, you know, like you guys have been quite charitable. You're saying, oh yeah, of course, there's going to be some bad things that come along. But the next section here, so I'm on page 8 at the top left, he says, I have reminded the reader that every state of welfare, every feeling of satisfaction is negative in character. So it's really the absence of something. And that something that's missing is pain, which is the ordinary experience for him. So that's the positive element of existence. So pain comes first. Pain and suffering are the kind of the go-to mode of being in the world. It follows, therefore, that the happiness of any given life is to be measured not by its joys and pleasures, but by the extent to which it has been free from suffering from positive evil. And then he goes to say that lower animals don't appear to have to suffer the way that man does, which is a similar argument you see in Lucretius, isn't it? But here I just want to say, and again, maybe the Epicureans will struggle here, but the Stoics don't, because there's a characteristic that comes before pain that's already built into the constitution of man, and that's part of that theory of oikeiosis. Man already has his built-in natural adjustment mechanism to meet and to select the things that are conducive to his own constitution. So he's got a capacity for dealing with suffering and difficulty as a kind of built-in innate capacity. And that is something that Schopenhauer doesn't seem to know about.
Yeah, that's right. It's exactly right. It's how he's similar to the Epicureans. So I think you look in vain in this essay for anything about relationships. The only thing he says about old school friends is how miserable they're going to be when they get together. It's like, is that all you can think about in a friendship, is how miserable you're going to be together? So as for the Epicureans, for whom there were no natural relationships, which is something we should always bear in mind, contra the Stoics, it seems the same as Schopenhauer. He doesn't acknowledge relationships as an integral part of being human, which most humans do acknowledge. I mean, I think even Nietzsche kind of has some space for relationships, maybe.
Yeah, and that's why for Schopenhauer, boredom is a profound experience, because he doesn't have a theory of oikeiosis. He doesn't have relationships of meaning with the things in the world. He's just got this, man is out of place in the world and it's bleak. But the other way of looking at it is that we are meaning-making creatures, and we bind to each other, and we bind to things in the world, and those things are meaningful adventures when we get involved in them. So, yeah.
In that section as well, where he's talking about the brutes, did anyone else feel like he could be talking about people as well? Like,
yes, absolutely.
There is there's probably like a proper word for it. But it's like intellectual wankery, where it's kind of like, you know, if you're not thinking about the ideas as deep as I do, or my community of intellectuals does, you're not really thinking, you're not really experiencing full life. You know, be the type of people that really like that. I think it was Socrates who had that quote of like, you know, a life without thinking is a life not worth thinking, or something like that. Like, they really take that to heart, and it's so yeah, you agree?
Yeah, and I think that's also something he's got in common with the Epicureans. You know, it's no accident that there's all this stuff about the animals. It's just a kind of extended metaphor for people, really. And yeah, and it's not clear that he is actually making any statements about animal behavior. He's just projecting what he imagines might be going on onto the brutes, as he puts it nicely.
So
yeah, that's an interesting point, just to follow on what you're saying, Judith, because obviously in Plato, and there's a quote here from Cicero that sort of towards the end, but Plato has this idea that he puts it in Socrates' mouth, doesn't he? That one thing we should be careful not to do is to become like animals. So we should try and retain our humanity. But the default position for Schopenhauer is that people are already kind of animals. They're being punished for crimes that they committed in a previous existence somewhere else, he even says, and tries to use Cicero to back up some kind of metaphor that the world's a penal colony or something like that. Yeah, so it's a bit like, yeah, he just starts at it from a very bleak kind of point on the spectrum. Sorry, Vincent, what were you saying?
No, I'm glad you got yours across, because mine's a little bit, it's a step sideways. But I do want to, in his defense, and in the defense of Nietzsche and other people that really chose that life, I don't think it's quite as neat and dried as that they were outcasts and they were shunned by society and stuff. I also feel as though they took a path that was courageous. You know, like, it is easier to not, you know, Schopenhauer and Nietzsche could have had an easier life. I mean, like with Nietzsche, for example, he basically created an obstacle for his mouth. You know, how could anyone kiss him? You couldn't. It was like he'd given up on kissing for life, so grow this huge thing. Schopenhauer was a little bit unkept, but when you look at the earlier photos, he wasn't you know, like a cleft palate or whatever. But you know, the point is that he forewent that life of comfort and social cohesion. And I think it was a bit of a choice and a courageous one. Yes, it would make you bitter. How couldn't it, if you spent that much time in isolation? It's interesting too, you know, it was like some of the great philosophers that have changed the world, they also sought isolation, but not to the same extent, not for as long as those two. So like Muhammad and the Buddha, and I'm stretching here, Jesus Christ, all of those people that went, took isolation for, was it 2 weeks or something like that? And then these great thoughts manifested. But if it became years and years, as it was for those guys, then yeah, of course you would become bitter. But still, it is a courageous path. It's just something that you wouldn't want to make your whole life, because otherwise, in the end, your philosophy is going to follow you down that downward spiral of depression. You know what I'm saying? So I just do want to give him credit for taking what wasn't an easy path. Maybe it wasn't. It was just because his ego led him that way, and what he really wanted, he craved, was you know, fortune and success, and to gain the widespread acceptance of some of the more optimistic people. But yeah, I think that point needs to be made too, because it's not as though I don't retract what I said earlier about looking at his personal circumstances and thinking, you know, that's quite sad, and he was a sad person, but also it was a courageous path too. You have to give him that. And people that choose their intellectual integrity over the comforts of the world. So then for them, life is really boredom versus suffering. Do you know what I mean?
Well,
I guess,
I just think, also,
sorry.
can I just say, I think you're giving him way too much credit, Vincent. I mean, okay, yes, I've just read the Wikipedia article about him, I will say that, but he had numerous relationships. And when I say relationships, so with women of lower class, essentially, who had no agency. He's believed to have had 2 daughters with these women that he had relationships with, who both the daughters died young. It's like he makes his point here in on the bottom of page 8. Basically, he says, you know, the basis of material life is simply health, food, protection from wet and cold, the satisfaction of the sexual instinct. Well, you know, he lived in a society where there were all these rules around having sex. He chose to stand outside those rules, but those rules were there. And, you know, we can be cynical about it, but the rules to some degree did act in protecting women. So for instance, that was why it was frowned upon to have sex outside marriage, because it led to the utter disgrace and impoverishment of the women concerned. He doesn't seem to have cared about that. So he had these relationships with lower class women, while, I don't think there's anything admirable about that. He seems to have regarded the women as well as kind of these, not actually humans in a sense. Maybe I'm going a bit far here, as I say. I don't know
the
much.
word you're looking for is cum receptacles.
Well, maybe that seems to be what he's getting at, but
yeah,
so I don't think there's anything admirable about that at all. Even when we can say that the social structures around relationships were cumbersome, to say the least, but to some extent they did protect women. So yeah, I wouldn't suggest that he was taking a particularly courageous path there.
Yeah. Awesome. I didn't know that, didn't have all that background, so that is a good point. I think what really poisoned him then, in a sense, was he was a misogynist and also his own ego, So he his path of isolation, the more that we learn about him, seems as though it was of his own bringing. Maybe it was Nietzsche that had more of a courageous life in that sense then.
I think it depends on your definition of courage. I think he should have read more Seneca, because in that case, he would have realized that courage meant something more in line with knowing what was appropriate to endure. And in this sense, it segues into the next part at the bottom of page 8, where he says, in his powers of reflection, memory, and foresight, man possesses, as it were, a machine for condensing and storing up his pleasures and his sorrows. And he makes an account that I've actually heard. I think I've read it in a book that was recycled, this kind of idea in the acceptance commitment therapy book, actually, that man is one of these, the only creature that can work up his sorrows to such a degree that he kills himself, which is an interesting observation. I didn't know it came from this text. There you go. But that's quite a striking fact, isn't it? Again, it tells you something quite unique about man, that man's use of his cognitive kind of faculty is a critical kind of tool, critical element. In order to increase his pleasures, he says, let's carry the analysis a step further. In order to increase his pleasures, man has intentionally added to the number and pressure of his needs, which in their original state were not much more difficult to satisfy than those of the brute. And so this is where you get your drugs and alcohol and tobacco and fine clothes and 1,000 other things. And these are the kind of things that the Hellenistic schools obviously critique. Above all and beyond all this, there is a separate and peculiar source of pleasure and consequently of pain. And he's talking about ambition and the feeling of honor and shame. In plain words, what he thinks about the opinion that other people have of him. So taking 1,000 forms, often very strange ones, this becomes the goal of almost all the efforts he makes that are not rooted in physical pleasure or pain. It is true that besides the sources of pleasure, which he has in common with the brute, man has the pleasure of the mind as well. And then he talks about boredom again. Boredom is a form of suffering unknown to brutes. So I don't know about the man thing when it comes to boredom, though. Obviously, animals might not get bored. I don't know if that's true or not. I think it's probably not true. But
where are you in the text, Courtney? I'm lost.
Middle of page 9 on the second side. Boredom is a form of suffering unknown to brutes.
Mm-hmm.
At any rate, in their natural state, it is only the very cleverest of them who show faint traces of it when they are domesticated. I think he is talking about animals when he talks about brutes.
And I think that he's actually accurate there. I mean, very, very smart dogs like border collies and kelpies, if they're not in a working situation, you can see them going a bit mad. So I think there's actually some observation going on there.
And I think it's interesting because, and I'm responding to what Vincent said earlier on in the piece, how in modern life, boredom is sort of ubiquitous if you're not being stimulated. And I got to say, in the prison, that's definitely the case. The prisoners are all worried about relapsing and using drugs again, because every single one of them will have boredom as the great enemy in the background. You know, for them, if they go outside the prison, which has a structured routine, they'll get bored. And if they get bored, they know they'll get up to trouble and use drugs. And so the question they ask is, how can you help me with boredom? And that's like, no one has an answer to that. And I was reading a book, and, you know, going back to your comment, Vincent, that it's something to do with modern life, perhaps, or perhaps not, perhaps it's something to do with human beings. But this book I was reading the other day, it's a guy who does research, an Aussie guy actually. He collects research articles and distills them so normal people like me can read them. He dumbs them down, and it's on the dopamine stuff, you know, the dopamine hypothesis and how it. Anyway, I know not everyone. I'm not a big fan of that brain, you know, biology stuff, but it is quite interesting, because the point they're making there, the research kind of makes, is that dopamine as a neurotransmitter is activated in, you know, or released into the synapse when there's something of interest in the environment. So, you know, you could think about all the pleasurable things that you see before you, but also it's activated in the opposite situation too, when there are things that we're averse to, because it's not, everyone says it's the reward pathway, but actually it's what motivates us away from things and towards things. So it works on thresholds. When there's enough dopamine in the system, we move towards it. So it actually has some kind of biomedical kind of bad publicity. Yeah, there's kind of this idea of I kind of lost my train of thought. Basically, if we become addicted to this dopamine fix always being there, because there's tons of stimulating things in the environment, or there's tons of stressful things that we can't escape in the environment. So frequency is one predictor, but another thing that triggers the strength of the dopamine here is also uncertainty. So we live in a world now where you can look at social media and uncertainty, boring, and then you get a hit because there's something exciting you want to see, whatever, you know. Same with the pokies. I don't know what life was like, obviously, for Schopenhauer, but the idea is that we become fixated with this kind of activity, this attachment to external stuff that's constantly stimulating us. And in the absence of it, we feel boredom, because our body develops a kind of baseline need to be stimulated all the time. Makes pretty good sense, right? Sorry for boring you with that long description. But the point is, physiologically, we become, it's like that Greek word you used today, Judith, hexus. We develop a disposition, a kind of habit for looking for stimulation. And that's part of the Stoic cure again, is if you want to deal with boredom, start to minimize the level of stimulation that the person's experiencing. Draw them inward, like Seneca says at the end of every day. Spend time focusing on your inner kind of states. And part of that whole prosoche exercise is to pay attention and be vigilant about the effect that impressions are having upon you. It shouldn't sweep you away. If you feel like they're overly stimulating, then get away from them, have a break from them. Sorry, I just wanted to make that point. Yeah.
No, I think it's totally true. Like, I have avoided what do you call it? TikTok, the Chinese thing, not because I think it's bad or any political reasons. It's just because I see it and I'm like, this would be the sort of thing I'll just get addicted to. Like, I could just, you know, because it's just, you can quit content, like you can just constantly flick through it, and yeah, it's really hard, like just trying to, when you've got all that noise around you, and it's like, you know, it's like the sirens up near the rocks, like they're calling you, and they've been customally designed that, you know, their song is very attractive. It's yeah, it's very challenging. Like, trying
Yeah,
to avoid that.
and more, they're designed that way. The people who design them know what they're doing. They have to be short. They have to grab your attention. They have to give a unpredictable reward. It can't give you the reward every time. All of these things are designed to maximize addiction. And that's what he's saying here. So obviously this is just the way human beings are when they get fixated on external things, external goods. You know, he says they will rush about in all directions, traveling here, there, and everywhere. No sooner do they arrive in a place than they are anxious to know what amusements it follows, just as though they were beggars asking where they could receive a dole. Of a truth, need and boredom are the two poles of human life. So that lengthy description I just gave you just is my way of saying, no, it's not. It's not. They're not these factual two poles of human life. They're just accidents for people who misuse reason.
I do like,
Oh, sorry, Sharon.
I do like the idea though around heading towards something versus running away, and how that can probably give you more drive in the negative sense, particularly. And I know it's not a good representation in terms of numbers or whatever, but you look at some founders and they're just so ultra successful because they were running away from inadequacy. So they had that chip on their shoulder to build the biggest company in the world. And, you know, if they were just heading towards building a company, they would not certainly be as successful as they are now. But yeah, it's just something interesting anyway, you know, because you obviously want to work towards something, but running away from something certainly gives you more of a drive to do it.
Sorry, Judith, what were you saying too?
Oh, sorry. I think Vincent was talking with his mute on, but I just wanted to say, what's really curious here is that basically he's saying things that Seneca would say. So he says, the bit you quoted, Courtney, no sooner do they arrive in a place and they're anxious to know what it, and so this satiric view of people and their amusements is kind of straight out of the Hellenistic philosophers. So in a sense, he does share a bit, some of the same worldviews.
What I was going to say also is that I feel another way to look at the boredom versus suffering dichotomy is that of stagnation versus growth. Now, obviously, not all suffering equates with growth. But going back to that idea that people in a stable situation, not in a war zone or not with deprivation, they would choose to put some suffering upon themselves, like mental hardship, reading a book, going to the gym, those sorts of things, taking on additional responsibilities. Yeah, that has to do with growth, and boredom may well have something to do with stagnation, not things not changing. And I kind of feel as though we get bored, we tune out of things when there's not change, and there is change that comes with growth. So another way of looking at it. Yeah, that's
definitely. And then he says, finally, I may mention, this is ridiculous, that as regards to sexual relation, a man is committed to a peculiar arrangement which drives him obstinately to choose one person. Well, he didn't, Judith said, you know. This feeling grows now and then into a more or less passionate love, which is the source of little pleasure and much suffering. So like Judith was saying, obviously he's quite cynical about love. And it's just not the case. There are plenty of people I know that get married and actually enjoy the company of their partner. It doesn't necessarily lead to much suffering. And also, there's nothing that drives you to be with one person. There are situations where people go and get multiple lovers. So none of that makes any sense to me. Anyone have a view on that?
Well, having multiple lovers, I mean, that does depend on your charisma or personal resources. You know,
I've got a charisma score of 20.
Nice. Maybe he didn't though. So I don't know. Maybe you know, you mentioned, Judith, about that he dated down, which to actually is the case to this day. So even you probably know this, so that even though a lot of women are making as much money as men and stuff, they generally feel a little bit uncomfortable having a partner that has lower education and lower earning than them. It's more pronounced in certain cultures, not as bad in the West, but that's true. Anyway, that's a side thing. So I don't know if he had an abundance of relationships. You guys have studied his biome more. Sorry, that's going to your point there, Courtney, about relationships. His views on those.
All right, so keep going. Where was I up to? Right. Okay. It is, however, a wonderful thing that the mere addition of thought should serve to raise such a vast and lofty structure of human happiness and misery, resting too on the same narrow basis of joy and sorrow as man holds in common with the brute, and exposing him to such violent emotions too, so many storms of passion, so much convulsion of feeling, that what he has suffered stands written and may be read in the lines of his face. And again, I think this is a good critique of Epicureanism, because yes, if you make gaining pleasure the source of happiness, you'll probably be vexed eventually. You know, it's maybe it is a losing battle. And again, he should read more Seneca, because there's another way of going about it. And getting rid of thoughts is not the solution. In fact, attending to one's cognitive states would actually be a wise way to go about it. But he doesn't seem to realize this, because he already has a negative view of nature, as opposed to looking to nature as potentially like, well, maybe we've been given reason for a reason, you know? He says the pains of life are made much worse for man by the fact that death is something very real to him. Again, I just wrote, well, that's a load of shit, because, you know, there are plenty of people in life who are terrified of death, but there are plenty of people who overcome that fear of death and it doesn't bother them. And in fact, the use of reason, again, is a really great way for dealing with those sorts of fears. And also, even if you don't want to go that far, the use of reason is a good way of avoiding most of those fears. Like, you're afraid of sharks, don't go in the water. You're afraid you're going to get hit by a helicopter? Well, stay away from helicopters.
I think that what drives on some levels people to have children is that is a way to offset their mortality, in a sense. You know, you have this idea that even though you're gone, that your spirit carries forward, or at least your genetics. So in his case, again, Judith, I'll defer to you. Done more of his background. You said maybe he had a couple of daughters, but I don't know if he was a father to any children he might have. So I wonder then, in that case, that his works of philosophy, his books, were all the more important for him, because it was sort of a proxy for having children. It was a alternative, in a sense, you know. So I gather from reading up on him that he didn't really gather much notoriety and fame until his latter years, and that would surely have made him quite bitter, because he may as well have felt as though he forwent a normal life, although I'm not sure if that was on the cards anyway, but he didn't have children at any rate that he was involved with. So then his philosophy was all the more meaningful, all the more important for him, because of the lack of that. Do you know what I'm saying? Whether or not he acknowledged that, whether he was conscious of that or not. But yeah, so that's just something, a thought I have relating to his ideas on mortality, on death, and, you know, life being finite and so on.
Yeah, I mean, so I think you're onto something there, Vincent. And certainly in Plato, in the Symposium, he talks about, well, in the great speech of Diotimus, he talks to Socrates about this whole idea of giving birth. And birth can be as it is for mothers, actually, physically giving birth, but it can be also creative generation, as it is for many men. And so I think in principle, yes, I think you're right there as to that might have been, on a charitable interpretation, what was motivating Schopenhauer. But I'll have to reserve judgment as to whether that was actually what was going on with him.
Yeah, I think Freud makes similar claims about the urge to procreate. And Richard Dawkins, in his Genes versus Memes or whatever, he makes that same sort of idea that memes are immortal and genes aren't, because they die out within a few generations because they how they get watered down. So he's responding to a similar thing. But yeah, interesting. He then says, but the fact is that man attains the natural term of years just as seldom as the brute. So he doesn't necessarily live to great ripe old age, because the unnatural way in which he lives and the strain of work and emotion lead to a degeneration of the race. And so his goal is not often reached. And I just thought, well, that completely ignores Seneca's point that if you had rational endurance, it would fortify and improve you and potentially lead to a better life. But yeah, if you focus on the misery and how worthless life is, you might end up having a stroke and a heart attack at a young age. That's true. Maybe I'm being flippant. So I'm on page 11 at the top. So he says, accordingly, the life of the brute carries less of sorrow with it, but also less of joy when compared with the life of man. And while this may be traced on the one side to freedom from the torment of care and anxieties, it is also due to the fact that hope, in any real sense, is unknown to the brute. And of course, this is like that idea that man projects himself into the future. I think I made a point of noticing that because if you remember our Lucretius reading, there was a link cognitively that Lucretius tries to make between gratitude and anger. And he was making the claim that they belong to a similar family of arguments, kind of cognitively, as in, for example, anger is someone's done something wrong to me and therefore they deserve to be punished, and gratitude is someone's done something good to me and therefore they deserve to be rewarded. So there's a relationship. And it seems also that hope could be seen that way. For Schopenhauer, hope is seen as a potentially negative thing because it sets man up for this care and anxiety, is one way of reading it. But again, I just think this is a very negative way of viewing what's positive in man, which is how to use reason correctly. If it's true that if you misuse reason, it could lead to excessive negative passion, the answer is not to abandon reason and to have some sort of lobotomy. It's to improve your use of reason, isn't it? And this is just where he's just ignoring this possibility the whole time. Do you agree?
Yeah, I agree. I thought it was interesting towards the bottom of the page, page 11 in the first column, where he comes around to, again, something that the Stoics could probably identify with. He says, that the animal's quiet, placid enjoyment of the present moment. Well, sure, the Stoics would tell you that all we have is the present moment and it's appropriate to enjoy it. So he seems quite on board with that, but he doesn't seem to have any way of achieving that or pursuing that, or even any desire. He can kind of see it as an ideal, but he he just doesn't quite get how to do it or commit himself to doing it, really.
Yeah, we don't know what his solution is, but I have a feeling, because he mentions on the last page that it's to turn your back on the world somehow, which is the exact opposite of what the Stoics are going to recommend.
I thought that his overall, from what I've read in the small amount I've read of his philosophy, from his main work, he's basically proposing that we shouldn't have been born at all. That's his main thesis, throughout his life, is that you're better off not ever being born. So, you know, this is pretty mild, really, compared to the statement that you should never be born at all, you know.
Well, I think that's how his solution stands, because at the end, if you recall, like skipping right ahead, he says that Buddhist conception is a good way of looking at it, that the universe was in a state of nirvana and then something upset it, and everything that appears in the universe appears because of a disturbance. So we are just a disturbance. So yeah, you're right, we'd be better to have never existed at all. Pretty ugly.
Just to check as well, are we just going over the Schopenhauer book today? Is that the plan?
We're studying Kant's prolegomena to any future metaphysics in 5 minutes.
Oh, okay, that sounds good. And then do the critique of pure reason after that?
No, Hegel's phenomenology of spirit.
Oh, okay, so a bit of light reading. Okay, that sounds good.
Yeah.
Are you naked in the spa with whiskey, Shannon? Is that why we can't see you?
No,
Oh.
still here. I just had my phone on charge, so it was kind of annoying trying to hold it. Sadly, but
So he says,
on
sorry.
beers at the moment.
What? Sorry.
Just on beers, but actually, I was going to jump on there as one, which I thought was interesting, how he represents the brute position, something close to the Stoics. This is just about halfway-ish on the second column, page 11.
He says
where he's saying,
evil, about evil?
Yeah. Yeah, like, but the brute's enjoyment is not anticipated and therefore suffers no deduction, so that the actual pleasure of the moment comes to it whole and unimpaired. In the same way, too, evil presses upon the brute only with its own intrinsic weight, whereas with us, the fear of its coming often makes its burden 10 times more grievous. It's like that part. It's very. I'm not sure. If, it sounds like Cordy. You might think it is similar. Yeah, it's like if you look at the brute part, it's like, oh, like it's not. I'm not saying it's 1-to-1, but you could almost replace like the Stoic position as being the brute in that case.
Well, the brute is only like that because it can't think. It's not extending itself temporally into the future, so it has no expectations. Whereas human beings are rational beings, and rational beings are concerned about what the future will bring for us, and that's the difference. So the Stoic is obviously got a solution ready, and that is to be unconcerned with external things and guard your reason as the most important thing. He doesn't have that solution. So his is, he doesn't have a solution other than to turn your back on the world. So again, it's a problem. His philosophy, and this is, I don't even get it. He's not even embarrassed to say it. It's a will to, well, it's a denial of life. And he actually agrees. Yeah, it's a denial of life. Yeah, duh. It's like, well, that's shit. Keep that to yourself.
I think we can at least say here, towards the end of page 11 and the start of page 12, he's obviously got a real feeling. I mean, he does seem to care a lot about animal welfare. So that's good. And maybe that's where he had his relationships, you know, just looking after animals or caring for animals. So that's really good. But at the same time, we can also recognize that someone who cares a lot about animals might not really care about people. And that may be what we're looking at here.
Something in my brain tells me that he had dogs. That just sort of popped into my head. So yeah.
I had a point that wasn't worth mentioning really, but then because Judith, you mentioned animals, it goes together with the other point about Nietzsche. So I'm going to put them together. Maybe it's a point together. So going back to Nietzsche again. My understanding is that they both had pretty solitary lives and isolation and stuff. But my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, is that Schopenhauer lived indoors and in a city environment, and he's got quite a bit to say about noise. He's a real introvert. He hated all the noise that went with that. Probably Nietzsche was the same. He couldn't stand it, and he got away from it. So he was living in an alpine environment, walking in mountains. He would just be surrounded by intense beauty all the time. I wonder if that informed his point of view in a way that Schopenhauer didn't, just their surrounds. And the second thing is the other connection between those two was just, you mentioned animal welfare, because I do recall hearing that what sent Nietzsche over the edge when the cheese slid off the cracker was a horse being beaten. So it may well be that they both shared this real empathy for animals, even though they referred to people unkindly. With animals, they saw them as being innocent.
So that story about Nietzsche's false.
About the horse being beaten.
Yeah, it comes from an article in 1920.
Okay, so the question still remains though, did Nietzsche share an affinity with animals that Schopenhauer seemed to?
But even if that's false, that story, which is interesting, are you sure it's false? Because I only mention that because it occurs also in Dostoevsky's novel, Crime and Punishment, where whatever his name is, Judith remembers,
Raskolnikov.
Raskolnikov has a dream after he murders the old woman, right? That the people bash the ass or the donkey to death in the street. Yeah. And then I thought Nietzsche had a similar experience, and I know Nietzsche was a huge fan of Dostoevsky, so it would have made sense, but apparently not true. There you go.
Sadly not. I really liked that story and I was devastated. But yeah.
So, talking about the animals at the end here, he says, it is this, that the will to live, which underlies the whole world of phenomena. So this is kind of where you see Nietzsche's idea. He talks about will to power. So the will to live is what causes all of the phenomena of the world, must in their case satisfy its cravings by feeding upon itself. This is where you get your dark appearance of nature as this cannibalistic thing almost. This it does by forming a gradation of phenomena, every one of which exists at the expense of another. So that's a very dark way of looking at it. And I don't even know if I agree with that. I think I had a thing by that Lisa Feldman Barrett recently who talked about this, the development of of eyes, and she basically saying that the latest evolutionary psych thing is that the reason why we've got such sophisticated eyes and things like that is because at some point an animal developed a mouth. They didn't always have mouths, but one did, and that made it consume other beings. And once that happened, there became an arms race, and the other animals had to develop eyes and ears and sensory tools to judge whether these things with mouths were nearby. So I think the point, what was the point I was trying to make there? Yeah, it doesn't apply to man. That's my point. It's a bad analogy. It's a totally false analogy. Maybe true for animals because there's a hunter-prey relationship, but not true for man because man's got this goddamn big brain through which no other animal can really get to him because he's a rational being. He can create guns and shit. Didn't you realize? So, you know, he's safe from the ravages of, he's not in this circle of nature that he's talking about. This will to life doesn't apply to him in the same way it does for brute animals, because there's no threat that I'm going to get eaten by a horde of rats tonight, for example. Do you guys agree with that, or do you think I'm getting carried away?
Well, he even says himself at the end of the paragraph at the top of page 12 on the right, he even throws it back to the reader and just says any further explanation that may be given of their fate will be in the nature of hypothesis. So he's saying he doesn't really know. He's really not making a statement there at all, if not actually mythical in its character. And may leave the reader to speculate upon the matter for himself. So he's not really trying to tell us one way or the other there, is he? You know.
Well, why bring it
he's
up?
talking about whether or not I've shown, however, that the capacity for suffering is less in animals than in man. So he is making a distinction there between animals and man in terms of
No, but what he does say is that all living phenomena that appears on the world is generated from a will to live. And that will to live exists by preying on other life in some form or other. And so therefore at the expense of other life. Yeah, he's being a bit Buddhist, I agree, because we could get by eating plants, all right? You know, that's fine. But still, nothing's going to eat me as far as I'm aware. So I don't see how it applies to me. But, and I made a note here. I thought, well, and this goes into what you guys were talking about, mental instability, for example, is the only time really that we become tormented by these kinds of fears is when we have irrational delusions. And it's kind of the stuff of psychosis. You know, you get into bed late at night and you're paranoid and the blankets appear to be consuming you. Like, that's not the kind of thing that an ordinary person has to worry about.
So just on that kind of will to power thing, and I haven't read any other Schopenhauer, so I don't really know how he draws this out. But
it's called the world as will.
Oh, sorry, yeah, the will to power thing's Nietzsche, but yeah, this is the world as will and representation. Yeah, this will idea. Again, it seems like a somewhat distorted version of, again, what the Stoics would have agreed. So the Stoics understood that every organism has the impulse, horme in Greek, impetus in Latin, has the impulse to preserve its life, to preserve its existence. Now, that will imply, you know, predation for some species, or you know, absorbing nutrients through the soil for plant species and so on. But it's a neutral phenomenon in itself, but he's put this negative kind of understanding on it, that it's entirely to do with predation and power and domination. And it seems to me that's a kind of a bit of a perverse spin to put on it.
Yeah, I agree. And in a way, I guess this goes to his Christianity, which is in the background, because the more naturalistic theism, if you like, of the Greeks will be, well, that's nature, you know, nature's positive, things are a delicate harmony, a bit like the whole Gaia hypothesis, the ecology, the ecosystem works in this kind of predator-prey relationship, nothing wrong with that. But for him, he's going to say, well, if there truly was a great and magnificent God who had all power, why did he create it like this? Why did he make it so that some animals had to predate other animals in order for them to survive, when he could have just made us live in harmony, holding each other's hands and sharing? I don't know, you know, it just, that's what he's going after, obviously.
I made a chat comment about, so it's Caligula. That's the one, and some of you guys probably read that from this Tool song. If you guys don't know Tool, it's a very smart band. They go back a while, and yeah, they're intellectuals and they think out what they sing about, and the music's amazing. Anyways, there's one of the early tracks which is Life Feeds on Life. I think that's the chorus, if not the name of the title of the track. I think it's absolutely true. It really is. And Courtney, when you were talking before about, oh, you know, we could always, you know, circumvent that by just eating plants. Well, hello, Courtney, plants are living beings too. They may not have consciousness or even brain stems, but yeah, it's life nonetheless. So how would you get around that? Well, I guess if every single being on the planet photosynthesized, then yeah. So as relating to humans preying on humans, I suppose you can use that as a sort of an extension of, say, colonization, which I guess was happening in his time, and other ways that certain societies would stomp down on others if it wasn't overt consumption per se. But the reality is that we don't have to face up to the consumption, us feeding on life, because it's done in a very just like the way we deal with death. It's compartmentalized, and unless you work in a slaughterhouse or on a farm, you don't actually have to deal with it day to day. You just buy packets of plastic packaged meat, animal byproducts, and even animal products too. I mean, the most hardcore vegetarians would only eat fruit because that means the plant doesn't have to die for you to eat the thing. It's not realistic. So yeah,
No,
it
I
is
get
very
that.
much.
That's all right, but that's not really the point. I was saying people don't get eaten. Well, I know
No,
we
but
eat
we
plants.
do feed on life.
Yeah, of
and,
course we
and,
do.
and the brutes certainly do.
But yeah, then that's all right.
Unless you're an apex predator, but even then, you know, you get shot.
Yeah, that's true.
But but there is that statement there though, after he's talking about the predation at the top of page 12 on the right hand side, where he says, I have shown, however, that the capacity for suffering is less in animals than in man. So he's sort of saying that predation in nature is nothing on our suffering, on human suffering. Like that's small fry.
Because we add thought and imagination to it. Yeah. Okay. So just moving ahead a little bit, I was just thinking, where are we up to? He talks about
Brahma.
Yes, he talks about the religions now, doesn't he? He says, by a series of mortal errors. So this is what you're saying, the Brahman point of view, is it? He says the world became gradually worse and worse, true of the physical orders as well, until it assumed the dismal aspect it wears today. That was the nirvana kind of thing, remember? And then he says, excellent. So he likes that view. Everything was perfect until there was a disturbance through some moral error, and that's the result. He likes that version of things. The Greeks, here's another plausible worldview, he says, looked upon the world and the gods as the work of an inscrutable necessity. So a passable explanation, he says, okay. We may be content with it until we can get a better one. So again, Ormuzd and Ahriman, rival powers, continually at war. That is not bad.
Is that the story in the earlier religion, the really early one, the one that
I think it's Zoroastrian.
Zoroastrian. That's Zoroastrian. Yeah,
that's right. And yeah, we remember Nietzsche writes his "Thus Spake Zarathustra," kind of playing on that. That is not bad, he says, but that a god like Jehovah should have created this world of misery and woe out of pure caprice, and because he enjoyed doing it, and should then have clapped his hands in praise of his own work and declared everything to be very good, he says that will not do at all. He doesn't like that one. In its explanation of the origin of the world, Judaism is inferior to any other form of religious doctrine professed by a civilized nation. Well, fair enough. I don't really have a problem with that. But this is weird. He says, and it is quite in keeping with this, that it is the only one which presents no trace whatever of any belief in the immortality of the soul, doesn't it? I thought Judaism was about the immortality of the soul.
Well, I actually had a quick look at this because I was a bit thrown by this as well. And I couldn't quite get to the bottom of it. Is there anyone who's got any?
Yeah, the early books in the Old Testament, they don't really start talking about the soul until Second Isaiah. It's around. There's a whole historical. It's traced by biblical scholars that idea of the soul came in later. It was brought in as an additional doctrine when they were in Egypt. Anyway, yeah. So the early books do not talk about the soul.
This next little section, I thought was a bit cryptic. Maybe we can discuss it. He says, even though Leibniz's contention that this is the best of all possible worlds were correct, that would not justify God in having created it, for he is the creator not of the world, but of possibility itself, and therefore he ought to have so ordered possibility so that it would emit of something better. there are two things which make it impossible to believe that the world, this world, is the successful work of an all-wise, all-good, and at the same time all-powerful being. Firstly, the misery which abounds in it everywhere, okay? And secondly, the obvious imperfection of its highest product, man, who is a burlesque of what he should be. These things cannot be reconciled with any such belief. Wow, he should have read the Stoics again, right?
Well, this, yeah, like this part, I found it really weird because it's like he's saying, even if we agree with Leibniz that like, you know, we live in the best of all possible worlds, he still could have made a world which is better. Like, isn't that what he's saying? Like, it doesn't really. If you're assuming that we do live in the best of all possible worlds, then there isn't a world better. Like, I don't really understand.
He's saying the world's not enough. It's not just the literal world, because that's kind of what happens with God, right? He produces a world and then he steps back from it in the transcendent kind of God. So he's saying, no, he has to create, he's also the creator of possibilities. So he has to create a world that, for example, has no suffering in it, right?
So basically, he's sort of saying that even in the best of the world at its best is not even that good.
Mm.
Is that the point? That okay?
I think it's a response to arguments, and I'm not sure if this is on Providence or not. I've got a feeling it's not. I don't think I remember it from just rereading it, but it is in some theorists. As I say, I can't remember if it is in the Stoics or not. I would say maybe not, but some people, or maybe it is in some of the early Stoics. Anyway, but the idea that the structures is just so that the creator god or gods were constrained by certain physical constraints on what they could do. So I think some part of the, maybe, and I should have looked at this, but some of the early Stoic theory was that the way the world is partly because the creator god or gods were working with certain limits on their materials and their on what they had to deal with. Now, I think the Christians didn't want to have that kind of restriction on the creator God. So the Christian version of arguments around creation did not admit of constraints on the creator. So I think Schopenhauer here is probably responding to that and in suggesting that an omnipotent creator should have had no limits on what he or she was able to construct. I think that's maybe what he's getting at.
Yeah, and it's definitely the case that, you know, if you're thinking about the fall, because that's what he talks about next, or original sin, that if God was the creator of possibility, he shouldn't have made it such that man would be living in such a deplorable condition, you know, having the original sin and that sort of situation to have to live with. Would have been better if he was pure. Yeah, he says that in the next section. We come into the world with the burden of sin upon us, and that it is only through having continually to atone for this sin that our existence is so miserable and that its end is death. There's nothing more certain than the general truth that it is the grievous sin of the world, so it's the world's fault, which has produced the grievous suffering of the world. I'm not referring here to the physical connection between these two things lying in the realm of experience. My meaning is metaphysical. Accordingly, the sole thing that reconciles me to the Old Testament is the story of the fall. In my eyes, it is the only metaphysical truth in that book. Even though it appears in the form of an allegory, there seems to me no better explanation of our existence than that it is the result of some false step, some sin of which we are paying the penalty. And yeah, the cheerful stuff.
Well, I think it gets at what I think is like one of the stronger arguments against omni-God, where it's like you have two worlds. You have one world with God by himself, another world with God plus a little bit of sin. And if you're looking at those two worlds, it seems clear that the world with just God is the perfect world. Like it can't get any better than that. Which therefore, undermines that idea. Yeah, maybe this is a bit tangential to what they're getting at, but yeah, I always find that a strong argument.
Yeah, the bottom of page 14 on the right-hand side, I just think this is the bit that really surprised me, that he would make, I don't know, I just wouldn't expect a philosopher to talk about denial of the will to live. But he says here, he sets up this contrast between the Greek and Christian idea of death. And in the Greek, it's this lovely, fine, antique sarcophagus in the Valley of Florence. Has a whole series of ceremonies, attending a wedding. Yay, it looks warm and inviting. From the formal offer to the evening when Hymen's torch lights the happy couple home. And you compare this with a Christian coffin, he says, draped in mournful black and surmounted with a crucifix. How much significance there is in these two ways of finding comfort in death. And I was thinking he was going to go down the line of saying, yeah, look how dark Christianity is. Yeah, I agree with that. That's a denial of life or whatever. But he says they're opposed to each other, but each is right. The one points to the affirmation of the will to live, i.e. the Greek one, which remains sure of life for all time, however rapidly its forms may change. The other, in the symbol of suffering and death, points to the denial of the will to live, to redemption from this world, the domain of death and devil. And in the question between the affirmation and the denial of the will to live, Christianity is in the last resort right. What?
Yeah, I didn't get that either.
He agrees with it.
Yeah.
That's crazy. He gives like this really dark kind of interpretation that you're just expecting him to go, yeah, so look, that's shit, isn't it? And he goes, and they're right.
Well, maybe it is because his view of humanity is as negative as the classical Christian view, I suppose. Humanity is a mistake. Humanity comes
it's
from
almost
this...
Gnostic. It's almost Gnostic by nature, in terms of the evil demiurge. It's that whole emphasis on how evil and terrible the world is, and that our escape from the world, our escape from the world is our final blessing, our final, our final escape to the good somehow.
Yeah, it is very Gnostic. I agree with you.
Yeah, like I said in the chat, I think it's like there can be like Calvinist sort of views where it's just that they would probably not like this characterization. The Calvinist position is basically like, yeah, God's evil, deal with it.
Well, no, I don't think that's right, Shannon. I think the Calvinist position is that all humans are fatally flawed and all deserve to be damned, but that just God, for his inscrutable decision making, has selected some to be saved.
Yeah,
I don't think there's any judgment on God for his capricious and inscrutable decision making. I think.
Oh no, yeah. They wouldn't accept that characterization. I guess it's just when I've heard Calvinists talk, it seems that's kind of what their position is. That it's basically like, yeah, like God created most people to suffer in hell for eternity. Just like accept it. That's God. God is good. How can you even question that? Like to me, that's just like it just sounds like what I would describe as an evil God, that he makes most people to with the foreknowledge that they will suffer for all eternity. Like that's pretty strong. And obviously, like there's so many different versions. I think like it's a relatively small sect of Christianity.
I don't think it is. I think it's huge, but I would agree with you, Shannon. But the curious thing is that I suppose that ultimately Schopenhauer is kind of in broad agreement, because he too seems to have a very low opinion of of humanity.
Yeah.
Well, I think when it comes to religion, over the centuries, over the span of human history, there's been some religions that have prospered and survived and others that haven't. And one example would be monotheistic religions versus polytheistic, and that's what happened in Europe. So that was one thing that made those religions endure, is having one God instead of many. And I'd say another is that you need the carrot and the stick, not just the carrot. So what that means is that you're offering up believers a heaven and a hell. That's just basic, I guess, psychology or motivation theory. So then, if you want people to be God-fearing, and by the way, here's a few little linguistic bombs coming at you. You probably know these ones already. You guys know what hello is all about? What that means?
Can you say that word again?
Hello. Hello, Shannon. Hello.
Oh, like literally hello.
How do you say that?
Hello.
I didn't get
it. Hello, Courtney. Do you know what that's all about? Jeez. No?
Is that an accent?
Oh, all right. Moving forward. I heard this one from a rabbi in backpackers in Dunedin, New Zealand. So apparently, hello, he told me, means hell below. That's what it is. Comes from those two words. So back in the day, most people were conscious of thinking about heaven and hell. Life was misery. They're looking at the big picture. So hello is a reminder. Hell's below. So be a good Christian. There's the stick. And then what about goodbye? Why would people say goodbye? But it actually means good comes from the word God, and by, be with you. So as you go, God be with you. Okay, so that's where it all comes from. Sorry, that's just on a bit of a tangent there, but going around to Christianity and these religions, and why don't they just make God good and everything great and gravy? It's all carrots and there's no stick. It just wouldn't. Those religions wouldn't endure as compared to ones that have both. So pretty much all organized religions do have a negative. There's a hell kind of arrangement as well.
Yeah, and we've read a strong critique of that in Therapy of Desire, because the Epicureans do a big critique on that one. But here, I think it's very difficult to apply our interest in the Greeks to this whole section, because obviously I'm tempted to argue the point about asceticism, but he's really talking about Christian asceticism.
Yeah, and he's also going to move into comparing the Old and New Testament, which is really quite interesting, because he sees a break with the law and the entry into the era where the New Testament, halfway down.
Read it out.
Yep, 15 on the left-hand side, and it says, the Old Testament represents man as under the dominion of law, in which, however, there is no redemption. The New Testament declares law to have failed, and free man and frees man from its dominion, and in its stead preaches the kingdom of grace to be won by faith, love of neighbor, and entire sacrifice of self. This is the path of redemption from the evil of the world. The spirit of the New Testament is undoubtedly asceticism, as you said, Courtney. However, your Protestants and rationalists may twist it to suit their purpose. Asceticism is the denial of the will to live, and the transition from the Old Testament to the New, from the dominion of law to that of faith, from justification by works to redemption through the mediator, from the domain of sin and death to eternal life in Christ, means, when taken in its real sense, the transition from the merely moral virtues to the denial of the will to live.
Yeah, that's the important thing, right? Like, transition from the merely moral virtues to the denial of the will to live. That's just messed up. So basically, he's talking about what you were talking about, really. Like, it's a very strong form of Protestantism. It looks like the Cathars or the Albigensians. What do you call them? The Gnostics. You could imagine these humans who somehow completely turn their back on on most ordinarily kind of I don't know, like involvement in the world.
Yeah, but that's right. He is right. That's in the New Testament itself. That's in the Gospel of Luke. You know, Jesus says basically, if you want to follow me, you give up your family, you give up your community. It's in Paul. You know, it's better to his only praise of marriage is that it's better to marry than to burn with lust. Essentially, it's a very lowest common denominator endorsement of the family. For the first time in the Judaic or the Greco-Roman world, that there was an anti-family ideology happening. It's better to live in a celibate community than it is to be part of a family. So yeah, I think he's got a strong case that the New Testament and not, you know, people like to say it's these kind of sentiments are Gnostic or somehow heretical. No, they're actually mainstream New Testament. It's just that people don't tend to dwell on that.
Yeah. Nowadays they drive around in Bentleys and stuff.
Yeah,
They forgot
right.
the bit in the Bible that says the rich man has less chance than the camel of passing through the eye of a needle. Okay, he says, my philosophy shows the metaphysical foundation of justice and the love of mankind. That's really ironic. And points to the goal to which these virtues necessarily lead if they're practiced in perfection. I just think, you know, like you guys are saying, he sounds delusional because he's talking about like he's like got this lofty way of bringing Christianity back to the people. But as you said, Judith, he's living with low-class women and having children with them and ruining people's lives, pushing old ladies down the steps. What else did he get up to in his free time? Probably had sex with his dogs too. At the same time, it is candid in confessing that a man must turn his back upon the world and that the denial of the will to live is the way of redemption. It is therefore really at one with the spirit of the New Testament. There you go. If you want a safe compass to guide you through life and to banish all doubt as to the right way of looking at it, you cannot do better, I love this, than accustom yourself to regard this world as a penitentiary. A sort of penal colony. Oh my God. Which is further justified by, yeah, he says at the end, this idea which was held by the Christian Father Origen, for example, was justified by certain objective theories of life. Yeah, rightio, mate. And it's just hilarious, like to compare this, for example, with Stoicism, because there in Stoicism, instead of seeing it as a penal colony, you get these other metaphors, like it's a festival, it's a holiday on a cruise ship. But here we get it's a penal colony. So, I mean, what kind of view of reality is that supposed to foster in the person, right? And then he says, Cicero in his remark that the wise men of old used to teach that we come into this world to pay the penalty of crime committed in another state of existence. That's what we were talking about earlier. And I think that's obviously something he's interested in because there's a similar idea, isn't there, in Jodi, in some of the Buddhist ideas, I think. Is that right? And he says, true Christianity, using the word in its right sense, also regards our existence as the consequence of sin and error. True Christianity. I like how he makes it clear, because obviously sin could be interpreted in other ways, you'd imagine. If you accustom yourself to this view of life, you'll regulate your expectations accordingly. This is starting to look like something we might see in the other Hellenistic schools. Not that this is a Hellenistic school, but he says, yeah, keep your expectations in check. Cease to look upon all its disagreeable incidents, great and small. It's
a practice. It's a technique. So, but he puts his own negative spin on it because he's looking at it as a penal colony rather than as a festival. But what's interesting, I think, is what comes next, where and this kind of really leads into Nietzsche, really. So he says at the halfway down the right-hand column on page 16, if he has a soul above the common, or if he's a man of genius, he will occasionally feel like some noble prisoner of state condemned to work in the galleys with common criminals, and he will follow his example and try to isolate himself. And that's where you get to what you were referring to, Vincent, his path of isolation. But there's nothing noble about just imagining that he's better than everybody else. But again, it's kind of Nietzschean. It's the great man who's above all those things that occupy everybody else.
That's right. And he says, this view of life will enable us to contemplate the so-called imperfections of the great majority of men, their moral and intellectual deficiencies, and the resulting base type of countenance without any surprise, to say nothing of indignation. For we shall never cease to reflect where we are, and that the men about us are beings conceived and born in sin and living to atone for it. And, you know, I think what he has here is a very pathological view. And we're talking about views that you could choose, you know, like, say, Marcus Aurelius's view of the world, for example, makes it look insignificant. But on the other hand, despite its insignificance, it gives great credence to our purpose and our duties in the world, regardless. You know, it's quite noble. Whereas in this way, it's doing a similar thing by zooming out in this way, but instead it focuses very narrowly in on the deficiencies of man. So it focuses on the failings. And the Stoic view, on the other hand, could do the same thing, but instead it appreciates the potential failings, but has nothing but respect for the kinship that we have as members of the same species, and acknowledges the potential in each of us for the use of that wisdom. So yeah, just so interesting to use a similar technique and arrive at such a terrible, terrible way of looking at things, you know. We're nearly at the end. Congratulations, we're right on track. Whatever folly men commit, he says, pardons the word to all. So this again might resemble the Stoics, perhaps. Whatever folly men commit, be their shortcomings or their vices, what they may, let us exercise forbearance, remembering that when these faults appear in others, it is our follies and virtues that we behold. Yeah, okay, fair enough. They are faults, going down a little bit, halfway down the page, they are faults that do not lie on the surface. I found this bit interesting, but they exist down there in the depths of our own nature. And this is where you see this view differing from, say, the Stoic view. Here, it's got nothing to do with the use of reason. It's got something to do with the nature of man. And should anything call them forth, these sins or deficiencies, they will come and show themselves, just as we now see them in others. So we're kind of powerless against them because it's just part of our nature, and we're here just to do penance. Do you get the same reading as me?
Yep.
Yep. And finally, in fact, the conviction that the world and man is something that had better not have been is of a kind to fill us with indulgence towards one another. Nay, from this point of view, this is great, we might well consider this proper form of address. And here we get the circles of Hierocles, right? My fellow sufferer. This may perhaps sound strange, but it is in keeping with the facts. It puts others in a right light, and it reminds us that which is, after all, the most necessary thing in life: tolerance, patience, regard, and love of neighbor, of which everyone stands in need, and which therefore every man owes to his fellow. So rather than something optimistic, like broadening the ties of the relational kinship in the circles of Hierocles, calling each other brother, sister, auntie, he's, hello, fellow prisoner and sufferer. Hey, dirtbag, how you doing? This is messed up, but I really enjoyed it.
At least he does reach that point where he's like, this is the first moment at which he's exhibiting some attractive fellow feeling. So I think we should give him that credit, that at the very end here, he's arrived at, as he says, love of neighbor. So that's good as far as it goes.
But the point is, his view is so dark and miserable that it doesn't matter what he writes in the conclusion. We know that he can't follow through with it because he's just going to treat everyone like a bag of shit, and he does. So in closing, I thought it was really fun, and I'm not likely to go and hang myself. Wasn't convinced at all. I think this guy is. I'm going to enjoy reading more of his stuff because it's hilarious. I don't know what the rest of you thought.
Yeah, I'd probably have similar viewpoints. I think he's like really good writer. Didn't find him agreeable, but yeah, it was fun to read. Like, I think it'd be interesting too. Like, if we do end up reading, or if I do end up reading more of him, just to see like that relationship to Nietzsche. Like, how does that connect? Because I have heard there is like connection between the two, and there definitely were like little pieces in this like, it's a very small piece that I felt like, oh, is this like something that sort of Nietzsche was drawing on, or is yeah, could sort of almost see it in Nietzsche. Yeah, I enjoyed it. It was a good one to read, to disagree with. And Courtney, for once, was not just blindly agreeing with the author. He actually disagreed with the author. I think it's the first time.
I could not even be generous this time.
Before we go, I just wanted to just mention, Judy, that idea on the origin of the belief in the soul for the Jews, in that it came out of the Messianic movement because they believed in a Messiah or a person that was going to come and save them, like a leader, like a you know, an army leader, like a military leader. And it sort of grew and changed with ideas when they were in slavery in away from home. Might have been Babylon, or was it Egypt? I'm sorry, but they were in captivity. And while they're in captivity, they gathered up ideas from the people they were living amongst, and it transformed into the idea of the Messiah became the idea of allowing the saving of the soul and going to heaven, and that's where it came from there, and that's why it was second Isaiah in the time of their captivity. Yeah.
Thanks, Jodie. Fascinating.
Yeah.
Quickly, some final words from everybody, what they thought of the text.
Well, I just wanted to make one last thing about the ending part about how referring to everyone as fellow sufferers, and that it reminds me of how one of the essential principles of Christianity is that we're all sinners. So we're all got some sort of shortcoming, and by default, then there is, I don't know, it's just a negative take on. Correct me if I'm wrong there, but yeah, going back to your question, Courtney, yeah, it was pretty interesting. I feel as though a lot of the discussions were sort of reading between the lines in terms of where he was coming to and his situation, and it really became a discussion of the author quite a bit.
That's because you kept bringing it up.
That's part of it for sure. But I do feel as though there's a number of truths in what he was speaking about. It's just that, I really think that if you want to have a well-rounded view of life, it would be equally bad just to read from entirely optimistic philosophers. That would really be an oversight. So I think that there's a continuum in terms of philosophers, in terms of like how positive or pessimistic their worldviews are, and it's really informative to have both, and ideally we find ourselves somewhere in the middle. And I don't think this is a dangerous text. I think that that we should be able to read all sorts of ideas, and really that's what we do, and that's what we've done here. And I feel like we're just kind of finding parts of it that is meaningful for us and that we can weave into our own personal philosophies and whatnot. And it's great. Like I'm quite envious of how you guys can reference his ideas and thoughts to all these other philosophers that you guys have discussed and read already. But I know that the more time I spend in these groups, that I get to know bits and pieces of these other great minds, and then gradually connect the dots as you guys have. So that's cool.
Thank you. And on that note, the group's been going for 3 years. Thanks, Judith, for posting that list of articles and books we've read. I was blown away. I can't believe we've read that much stuff. That's insane.
It's been great. Thanks, everybody. And yeah, no, lots more to come. And thanks for Ray for posting these notes in the chat, because that's really informative.
Yeah. Did you want to say anything, Travis, or you already did?
No, just good. It was good listening.
Okay, great. All right, guys, I will love you and see you later, and catch some of you tomorrow.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
See ya.